okay? So hopefully that's clear enough. Now, one of the things that I talk about in my new book is that there's actually 4 different kinds of fear, and each one of them has a slightly different solution, though ultimately all solutions are in the gospel, okay? So let me show you here what I'm going to call a taxonomy of terror. Now, that's taxonomy, not taxidermy for my hunter friends, okay? Difference there. Taxidermy is when you stuff a dead animal. A taxonomy is when you break down categories to make them more specific for the sake of discussion. Okay, so I'm going to taxonomize fear into these 4 categories. These are the 4 things that we're generally afraid of. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm juxtaposing rational and irrational on this side, and then natural and supernatural on this side. And when you juxtapose these into what we might call a quadrigram, you get some interesting new categories. So let's look at a rational fear that's natural in origin. We might call that a natural, rational fear. And I'm going to give plenty of examples of these as we go. But not all fears are rational. Some of them don't make sense. Sometimes you're afraid of something and you're not sure why. It doesn't even make sense to be afraid of that, and yet you are. So it's irrational, okay? So an irrational, natural fear is something that we fear from this world, but it doesn't make sense. Why am I so afraid of this? I don't know. It's irrational, okay? Well, you're going to have to confront that somehow, so we're going to talk about how. On the other side of the board, there are supernatural, rational fears. There are supernatural things that it makes sense to be afraid of, and you should be afraid of them. The most obvious is God. He is supernatural and he's rational, okay? Because he exists. But, finally then, there are irrational supernatural fears that don't make any sense at all, and they're supernatural in origin, but they have no power over you whatsoever. There's no reason to be afraid, okay? So if that has confused you, let's break these down and let's look at the 4 kinds of fears in a little bit more detail. Let's start with this one. We're going to call this one number 1. Irrational supernatural fears. Now, an irrational supernatural fear is nonsensical because it doesn't have any real essence. There's no being there. There's no there. And yet they feel very real to us, and the reason that they're so terrifying is because they are ideated from the supernatural world. In other words, from the realm that's beyond our daily experience. Now, the best way to think of irrational supernatural fears is childhood fears. Okay, these are the things you were afraid of when you were a kid. They're irrational, they don't make sense, but they're supernatural because they have otherworldly power. When I was a child, the scariest movie I ever saw was a movie called Poltergeist, okay? Have you ever seen that? Don't watch it, it's terrifying. There's a scene where a clown doll comes to life and it attacks a little boy out from underneath his bed. And I watched that scene and I was afraid of that for months. But that's an irrational fear because clown dolls don't actually come to life. It's irrational because it doesn't make sense. It's supernatural, though, because that clown doll was acting in ways that clown dolls don't actually act. Okay? So that's a childhood fear. And a lot of us, when we were kids, we were afraid of things that were completely irrational. They did not make any sense whatsoever. And so if we were to list out some of these things, you might even still experience these, even as an adult. Okay? Scary movies, ghosts, the idols in the Old Testament. Isaiah goes on a really powerful diatribe against the idols because the people were afraid of them, but they don't exist. They don't have real power. There's no there. They don't have actual potency to harm you. Okay? Some cultures, especially non-Christian cultures, this is a key phrase, especially non- or pre-Christian cultures, they very often fear supernaturally irrational things because they don't have a Christian worldview yet. Okay? So when I went to Africa, they were afraid of all kinds of ghosts and fairies and other things like that because their worldview had not been Christianized. And so we call those things sometimes cryptozoology. You ever heard that term before? That's like Bigfoots and that's gnomes and fairies and other goblins and things like that they're not real. And what happens is Christian missionaries often go to places like Africa and they teach them the gospel and they realize that all these things that they're afraid of have no power over them, and so their worldview is Christianized, and then they're less afraid of the things that go bump in the night in the woods. And they realize that there's actually rational reasons why there's noises in the dark and so forth. Now, we still, even though most of us probably don't live in this box, we still do sometimes get that eerie feeling when you're in a building by yourself in the dark. You get that little hairs on the back of your neck type of feeling. That is, once again, irrational supernatural fears. They don't have any power over you. You should not be afraid. Does that make sense? And so what should happen to a Christian is this, that as you get older, you realize that you're afraid of different things. If you're not afraid of different things than you were as a child, something's wrong with you. If you're still afraid of the things that you were afraid of when you were 5, you're not growing, okay? So as you get older, as you move from baby face to peach fuzz to goatee to full beard to gray face like me, what should be happening, that's a metaphor, by the way, you should be changing the things that you're afraid of because you're growing out of the things that you were afraid of before. Does that make sense? So I was afraid of monsters hiding under my bed when I was a kid. And then what happened is I grew up and I started to be afraid of things like, are people going to like me at school? And then I grew up a little bit more and I started to think about, gosh, what am I going to do with my life? I hope I find something meaningful to do. And then I grew a little bit more and I started asking myself, am I really living for Christ? Like, am I really going for it in the way that I should by the power of the Spirit? And then finally, by the time you're an old man with a gray beard, you ought to be afraid of things like this. Am I leading a godly legacy? That's a real fear. Am I leading the kind of life that actually leads a real impact for Christ? And so in the category of irrational fears, we should be growing out of these things. And the way that we grow out of these things is by catechesis. The more we identify with a true Christian worldview, the more we realize our childish fears should be left behind, and we should be acting in ways that become a grown man. Make sense? Everybody with me on that? Nod your head if that makes sense. All right, let's go on to the next box. Rational supernatural fears. Now, some of you are saying, yeah, but there are ghosts. They're just demons. Okay? Well, ghosts don't exist, but demons do. Well, that's now in the